And therefore, when you hear people talking about states' rights doesn't mean Jim Crow. There is no such thing under the 10th Amendment of a state's right to create dispersed fiefdoms of tyranny that are free from federal meddling. That's a falsehood, and it's especially made clear as a falsehood after the Civil War. Because during the Civil War, of course, the great tragic error of our U.S. Constitution was corrected. We eliminated slavery. And whatever you may think of the role of federal policy in establishing and allowing slavery to exist, there's no doubt the founders thought the states had sovereignty over the issue. That was wrong. And that was corrected. The Civil War also did a number of other things besides eliminating slavery. To the 13th and 15th Amendments, it also made it clear that our system of dual sovereignty between the states and the federal government has one fundamental purpose. It is not federalism as an end in itself. And it's not ensuring that state sovereignty is immaculate and unmolested. It is to preserve liberty. The whole point of dividing up our government in this nation between two levels, federal and state, not because we like to have local control. That's an element. That's not the ultimate reason. The real reason for dual sovereignty is it's a check and a balance and a diffusion of power that prevents government coercion from being abused. Its ultimate aim is to secure individual liberty indirectly, whereas, say, the First Amendment tries to secure it directly. And for a short period of time, a sputtering start, mostly for white males, federal courts occasionally enforced this vision, often vigorously defending the principles that limited government at all levels in America was meant to be the ideal. And this was done against aggressive attacks by the so-called progressive movement at the turn of the century. The so-called Lochner era has been unfairly maligned. From 1902 till about 1935, federal courts vigorously and appropriately struck down both federal and state regulations of peaceful, productive activities. The right to earn an honest living, the right to keep what you earn, from efforts to increasingly centralize government both at the state and federal level and to exceed the boundaries imposed by our concept of limited government. In fact, the thing to understand here is that the federal judiciary kept the dominant philosophy of socialism, which really was academically dominant, was politically dominant, was socially dominant, during much of the early part of the 20th century, from eclipsing the vision of government that the founders had, of course, until FDR. When FDR finally got enough of the federal judiciary's consistent striking down of New Deal programs, in 1937, he threatened to pack the court. It's the old switching time, save nine. He actually threatened to have the House double the number of federal judges, appointing political hacks that would pass any New Deal program that had been struck down. And as a result of that threat, which may or may not have had a political reality to it, one of the 5 justices that had been holding the line against the New Deal and its cartelized vision of quasi-national socialism changed his vote. It was the switching time who saved 9. And after that, after 1937, the original vision of the U.S. Constitution as a limited government document quickly evaporated. But the thing to underscore here is we beat up on federal judges a lot. But they're not the only ones to blame. Because what's worse, lacking courage or being the person who pushes someone to that edge? I mean, the truth is, in the New Deal, it was the executive and the legislative branches that forced the hand and caused the switch that happened. If the justices had held their ground, there's nothing that could have been done by the executive and legislative branches. The real problem was that the justices refused to act as a co-equal branch of government and check the excesses of the executive and legislative branch. They knuckled under. But the bottom line regardless of how the U.S. Constitution got to where it currently is, the fact is the U.S. Constitution is now a minimal check on the excessive uses of government power that most affect law-abiding ordinary citizens. I mean, if you think about it, it's awfully strange that we have really robust protections against self-incrimination. You've got the Miranda rights that if you screw up, you're basically toast as a prosecutor. You've got really robust freedoms to use birth control. But when it comes to earning an honest living in a given occupation that's ordinarily safe, like, I don't know, barbering, almost every state has a licensing regime that makes it either a misdemeanor or a felony not to get the government's permission to pursue that. And there are equivalent things that have been sustained at the federal court level under the U.S. Constitution for decades. So we have a bizarre situation here where our strongest constitutional protections are focused on the most peripheral freedoms, and the weakest constitutional protections are focused on the areas of freedom that we need most to survive. Our property gets very little protection. Our ability to earn a living gets very little protection. Even our free speech is increasingly losing its protection. Meanwhile, you've got your choice counts. And that doesn't mean I don't believe in that sort of freedom. It's just that the bottom line is that there's an inversion of priorities going on at the U.S. constitutional level. But what's the fix? The problem is this. I can complain about all these infractions all day long, but what do we do to stop it? Well, let me first suggest something that everyone's sort of suspecting on their own, as you can see with the rise of the Tea Party movements, as you've seen with the rise of the 10th Amendment movements, as you've seen with the town halls that have exploded with opposition, as you saw with the Tea Party march in D.C. People are starting to understand that it's time for the pendulum to swing, to borrow a cliche, for the states and for local action to take the lead when it comes to protecting rightful liberty, what Thomas Jefferson called rightful liberty, the freedom to act subject only to the like freedom of others. They're recognizing that states must stand up and right the balance between government power and individual freedom. Whereas after the Civil War, it became fashionable to expect the federal government and the federal judiciary to rein in the states. Now we need the states to rein in the federal government. And increasingly, everyone is recognizing that if there's any hope for our republic, that means returning to the principles of limited government that our nation is based on. Reminding that that's what our entire nation was based on. This just idea of limited government was not limited to the federal government. This used to be an ideal that constrained all government. It was the essence of American government. Fortunately, as my report shows, and you're welcome to grab a copy, most states have constitutions that reflect the fact that their founders stood upon the shoulders of giants. They improve upon the goals of the founding fathers in memorializing the principles of limited government. For example, many state constitutions, including Arizona's, explicitly prohibit occupational regulation in a variety of fields. They prohibit state-created monopolies. They require balanced budgets. They bar corporate bailouts. Alabama's state constitution, and you really ought to listen to this because this is music to my ears. Alabama's state constitution says proudly, and I quote, "The sole object and only legitimate end of government is to protect the citizen in the enjoyment of life, liberty, and property, and when the government assumes other functions, it is usurpation and oppression." End quote. Just imagine if a similar phrase like that had been put into the U.S. Constitution today. Now, I don't want to sound like a Pollyanna here. State constitutions have been eroded, just as the federal Constitution has. But my study has shown